So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the International Forum on Sustainable Asia and Pacific 2020, organized by the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. We're going to start with our third thematic track entitled, Can Co-Innovation Accelerate Japanese Technology Transfer in Asia? We have a panel of distinguished guest speakers here from many parts of the world, as well as IGES researchers, and our session will run 90 minutes long. I hope that from your computer or mobile device, you enjoy watching our discussions. My name is Eric Zussman. I am the research director for our Sustainability Governance Center here at IGES. And I will help to provide some overview of the session at the very end. Before we start moving through the session, I'd like to highlight two quick points. First of all, that for our viewing audience, I'd like to encourage you to use Slido to interact with us. Slido will allow you to raise questions and make comments on the session via the session webpage. And I would also like to underline that at the end of our session, we will be asking you to kindly respond to a 2-minute survey with a URL code. Please hang on with us for 2 minutes at the end of our session. And with that, I would just like to say that I think the theme of our session, co-innovation, is very much about this dynamic and iterative learning process. And that in many ways is a metaphor for what we hope to achieve here today over the next 90 minutes, a learning process. So I'd like to now turn the microphone over to IGES former executive director, Hideyuki Mori.
Thank you very much, Eric. Greetings to all from the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. Ms. Enomoto, the head of Asian and Pacific Center for Transfer of Technology of UNESCAP. Dr. Ghosh, CEO and founder of Council on Energy, Environment and Water. Dr. Sethi, Senior Director, the Energy and Resources Institute, TERI. Mr. Jugal, Principal Climate Change Specialist, the Asian Development Bank, ADB. Mr. Gentry, General Manager and Country Head of TLV India. My colleagues, Kentaro Tamura, Eric Zussman, and Nanda Kumar, and the distinguished audience. It is a great pleasure to offer the opening remarks to this important event, jointly organized by the Energy, Climate and Energy Division and the Kansai Center of IGES on the occasion of the International Forum for Sustainable Asia and Pacific 2020. The global community is at a critical juncture today as COVID-19 has made catastrophic impacts on humanity and the economy. While unforgettable loss of human lives due to COVID-19 and the struggling global economy continue to pose challenges, countries across the world need to stand together to show our resilience and to give momentum to our fight against climate change. Achieving sustainable development goals and moving toward the net zero world are important responsibilities before us today. Here, advanced technology emerges as a critical determinant in shaping efficient response, recovery, and redesign of the global economies. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to open this session on this theme related to the role of co-innovation in accelerating Japanese technology transfer to Asia. I congratulate the IGES team as well as external collaborators for joining hands in this important research theme. On behalf of the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this thematic session on technology transfer. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Mori-san, for these encouraging and timely remarks. Now I'd like to begin to move the session forward by turning the microphone over to my colleague, Kentaro Tamura. Excuse me, to my colleague, apologies there, Nandu Kumar, who will provide a framing presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Sussman. Let me share my presentation to start. Okay, thank you so much thank you so much to my colleagues and the external participants and audience for making time to attend this important session. My presentation today is about co-innovation, in which I try to explain a brief background on this concept of co-innovation and the possible nuances about this concept. This is a part of IGS project, ongoing IGS project on co-innovation, where we have internal IGS team as well as external participants are involved in. As a background, I would like to say that the demand for clean technologies in developing world has been growing significantly over this past many years, primarily to meet the climate mitigation goals. And the COVID-19 also brought in another situation, another interesting scenario, that there's a demand for newer technologies, as some of the countries are looking forward to sort of enhance their self-sufficiency and also strengthening strengthening their local economies. So one of the reasons for looking at the technology transfer in a much more constructive way is that there have been certain limitations in the traditional technology transfer in terms of affordability, in terms of adaptability, and also the market competition. And this is a place where we would like to bring in the co-innovation as a possible opportunity where developed countries and developing country can jointly develop technologies and advanced equipment and machinery in the host country to provide to the local market. So co-innovation as a concept is sort of defined as a collaborative and iterative approach to jointly innovate, manufacture, and scale up technologies. Here we give a special focus on low carbon technologies. As a process, in order to, with regard to the process, how does this collaboration happen and how countries can collaborate and move forward in their co-innovation initiatives? I'll show this framework which we envision as a background for working on this co-innovation. The collaboration is a first step where countries are deciding to participate in a joint initiative for a certain technology development or technology fine-tuning. And as a next step, which is a core of this co-innovation approach, this has different stages where the partners can enter any stage into this. These are the partners can come together at the design or development stage, at the production or co-manufacturing stage, co-monitoring or evaluation stage, and scaling up of these technologies. As a last step, we wanted to actually highlight what are the importance of co-innovation and what benefits co-innovation can offer. For the source country, the co-innovation can bring in, source country means the country where the base technology comes from. They'll benefit in terms of getting a wider market for their products. They'll also be able to scale up to other markets And one of the potential benefits for countries is about achieving carbon credits by saving emission. And so this is also one of the benefits for the source countries. In terms of the recipient countries also, there are these benefits in terms of employment generation, in terms of meeting this technology demand for various sectors. So all these, I'm sorry for this smaller slide, smaller font, but this slide will be a cleaner slide, will be available online soon. So these are the three stages of co-innovation, and we have been working on this concept and also have been trying to understand what are the possible opportunities and some examples happening across the world. One of the most interesting example I would like to share is that the Maruti Suzuki's development, though it has not been based on a co-innovation from beginning, what is happening in as a process is co-innovation, where the Japanese prominent transportation company Suzuki is collaborating with Indian initiative Maruti, and has created one of the household name, we can say, in India, that is Maruti Suzuki, which is everyone, almost everyone in India has this car, everyone who can afford the car. We also have several. We have also have identified several examples of co-innovation in Indonesia, Vietnam, and Cambodia. We have been studying about this and trying to understand in which all actually are the specific examples, specific cases where we can cite, we can find similarity with co-innovation as a model. In the next slide, I would like to show some of the basic differences between the technology transfer in a conventional approach and the co-innovation. In a conventional technology transfer approach, we can see that the technology is based on the source country or the source entity, and it is transferred or sold to another country. But in the co-innovation case, since it is a sort of a collaboration between the developed and developing country, the innovation is mostly sort of locally led. And in terms of research and development, technology transfer pathway is sort of more of source country driven. But in terms of co-innovation, it is sort of based on joint R&D. And technology transfer supply, in terms of conventional technology transfer, it is import basis, but in terms in co-innovation, it is local production. So some of these important examples I have cited, and one of the most interesting element I would like to highlight here is that the cost of conventional technology transfer is very high, but one of the key targets we would like to achieve is that competitive cost for through co-innovation. So this approach is collaborative, local knowledge driven, and cost effective. Focus areas include low carbon technologies and areas specifically like air pollution, energy industry, etc. And benefits are involving multiple stakeholders and multiple advantages for source and recipient countries. I come to the last slide of my presentation. One of the most important and interesting debates that is happening across the world is about net zero. I believe technology collaboration will be a key determinant in supporting countries achieve net zero targets. Be it industry, technology collaboration in industry, be it transportation sector, be it energy or waste or building sector. These are some of the key sectors that are responsible for high emission. And here, all these sectors can have benefits from co-innovation. But what we need to do for enhancing, for strengthening co-innovation is building policies and institutional infrastructure, building or shaping a conducive intellectual property regime, and also generate or support finances and public participation. With this, I would conclude my presentation. I would like to highlight and thank my colleagues who have been involved in this in this research project, and also the external research collaborators from Ritsumeikan University, from Terry, India, and from CEEW. Thank you so much for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Nandakumar. Very useful framing presentation, which highlights the importance of this co-innovative process and some of the differences with the more linear technology transfer model, and also links it to the importance of some of this work on zero carbon or net zero pathways. Now I'd like to turn the session over to my colleague, Dr. Kentaro Tamura. Tamura-san, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning and good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Kentaro Tamura, Director of the Climate and Energy area of IGES. I will be the moderator of this panel discussion. Today, I'm very pleased to have wonderful speakers to discuss the concept of this co-innovation with well-balanced background from international organization, research institute, development bank, and private company. So we have 5 guest speakers. First, Ms. Michiko Enomoto. She is the head of Asia and Pacific Center for Transfer of Technology, APCCT of SCAP. Her office is located in New Delhi, but today she is joining us from Switzerland. And next, Dr. Arnab Ghosh. He is a founder CEO of the Council of Energy, Environment and Water, CEEW, and he is joining us from India today. Then Mr. Girish Sethi, he is Senior Director of Energy Program at TT3. And also we have Mr. Virendra Kumar Dugal. He is a Principal Climate Change Specialist at ADB. And finally, but not least, we have Mr. Piyush Shainatri. He is a General Manager and Country Head of Indian Operation of the Japanese company called TLV. So after listening to their views on the co-innovation, we will move on to Q&A session. And after that, my colleague Eric Zatman will provide some summary of this session. So having said that, I'd like to ask Ms. Enomoto, you have now floor.
Thank you, moderator. Developing countries typically rely on foreign technology suppliers to meet national climate and energy goals, especially low-carbon technologies in key areas such as transport, industry, power, and building sectors. UNCTAD estimates annual global investment gaps toward climate change mitigation, research and development climate-friendly technologies to be in the range of $380 to $680 billion. Green technologies unlock immense opportunities in sustainable development goal areas such as environment, clean air and water, sustainable industries, and sustainable agriculture. IGES defines a co-innovation as a collaborative and iterative approach to jointly innovate, manufacture, and scale up technologies. This concept includes 2 important components: joint development or improvement of transferred technology and the transformation of such technologies into marketable and scalable products. Usually, this commercialization phase, the second part of technologies, requires heavy investment for long durations, as you can see in this chart. this chart indicates the death valley of death, because many innovative technologies in reality fail to become commercially viable products. And because innovation is a process of transforming developed technologies into commercially viable products. This process is very long and very expensive and very risky. Usually it takes about 5 years up to 20 to 30 years for some pharmaceutical industry goods. So most of the innovation dies in the middle of this valley of death. So in addition to these general problems, many developing countries, of course, depends on the level of development, have additional challenges such as limited absorptive capacity of transferred technology, limited protection and enforcement of intellectual property rights, high tax on imported goods, high cost to broadband access and other essential infrastructure, challenging business environment, limited access to finance, among others. So what would be actually in these circumstances, what would be the practical and main realistic driver of co-innovation in developing countries? I see the transnational corporations, TNCs, and foreign direct investment. They are the keys to advance co-innovation. It is because in advanced economies, private firms undertake the bulk of research and development. For example, the business sector's share of total research and development ranges from 60% in Singapore and to 78% in South Korea. Like the United States is about 72%. So we have to see the role of the private sector in advancing co-innovation. In particular, transnational cooperation will bring in foreign direct investment, has a great influence in local economy and opportunity for co-innovation. Transnational corporations have research and development capacities and low carbon technologies, which is needed in many developing countries. Funds to invest in overseas, which is quite often lacking in many developing countries. Capacity to manufacture and brand name, linkages with global value chain and access to global market. So transnational corporations through foreign direct investment can create jobs and provide opportunities for co-innovation to the recipient country. So unfortunately this year we see the COVID-19 pandemic. It will cause dramatically drop in FDI in 2020s, up to 40%. It is very serious. Thereafter, it is uncertain. Developing economy likely to see the biggest fall flows in developing Asia will be severely affected, about 35 to 45%. So what could be the strategies for developing countries to foster co-innovation with developed countries? This will be the combination of strategies to strengthen national innovation systems, promote foreign direct investment, environmental policy, and enterprise development strategies. In particular, it is very important to participate in co-innovation, enhance local technological capacities to increase absorptive capacities for technologies, and to participate in co-innovation. Improving linkage between innovation stakeholders in countries such as academia, industry, financial sector, government is important. Protection and enforcement of intellectual property is one of the very important elements which affect the decision of the transnational corporation to invest in your country or not. And ensure good infrastructure, for example, low-cost broadband access, and free movement foreign experts, and low tariff in trade in innovation-related goods. So also, it is very important to have a policy to promote technology-oriented FDIs. In 1980s and 90s, Singapore is one of the examples who successfully utilized this technology-oriented foreign direct investment in their own country and promoted their technological capacity. And it is also important to encourage high value added activities to firms to foster technology upgrading and provide incentives for technological collaborations and technology transfers. And also important to increase demand for innovation because after co-innovation, you have a final product, but it is eco-friendly and low-carbon technologies, which is quite expensive. And if the consumers are very price-oriented, the product will die. So there is some role for the public procurement, like a large-scale purchase, increase domestic consumption of such goods, so that we can increase the demand of such technologies and also integrate technological needs when discussing official development aids. So lastly, can co-innovation accelerate Japanese technology transfer to Asia? It is yes. However, and in particular, Japan is almost the world's largest investors in science and innovation, spending about 3.5% of GDP, and most of them are in the private sector, research and development. However, biggest challenge Japan faces is a low openness for foreign knowledge and technology. This is evidenced by the low level of international co-authorship and co-innovation, and the low level of foreign direct investment in Japan. This is partly because Japanese language is very special and many researchers and company owners are not really proficient in Japanese. So it is very important for Japan to further enhance the openness of the Japanese economy to foreign knowledge and technologies. It includes by continuing to encourage greater international mobility of researchers. I see so many young researchers in overseas in Japan, they fly and flourish. So young researchers are the hopes and they can break the burden of the Japanese language and they are able to accelerate future co-innovation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Enomoto, providing us some your view on the co-innovation, particularly highlighting some role of transnational cooperation in FDI and also national innovation strategy or systems. Thank you very much. And actually, now we have a couple of questions, but due to time management, I'd like to pick up some questions after the Q&A session, after we listen to all the presentation. Okay, I'd like to move on to next speakers. Dr. Arnav Ghosh, you have a floor.
Thank you, Tomoru-san, and good day to all of you. Many thanks for inviting me for this very important session. This is a topic very close to my heart, and I'm delighted to be engaging on a conversation on this. And I really, really hope that beyond just this panel discussion, that something more concrete can actually truly emerge between India and Japan on co-innovation. I do have a slide to share, but I'll share that slide a little later in my presentation. But let me start with what it is that I believe we need to focus on. And that is, what is the vision that we have in terms of co-innovation for low carbon technological development. The vision should be very clearly articulated. And it's important because we are in a particularly difficult year where economies are down. R&D budgets are really going to be perhaps the last thing that governments might be looking at when they have to recover their economies. At the same time, the environmental crisis is here and now upon us. And therefore, how we come out of 2020 and what kind of arrangements we make for collaboration, for technological collaboration that yields both economic growth and sustainability and creates jobs will be absolutely critical. The vision should be about innovations that create indigenous and collaborative technologies and the applications of science so that the dependence on imported, unadapted technologies reduces, and instead there is a space for more inclusive, more bespoke, more better designed, locally suited technologies that emerge that solve for, as I said, jobs, growth, and sustainability. Now, for many years, I have been thinking about and researching on what are the challenges that we face in terms of collaborative technological innovation across the world. And why do I ask that question? A few years ago, I looked at more than 30 different technological multilateral technological collaboration initiatives that had been created for low carbon technologies. Some had come up under the framework of the UNFCCC, some had come up under the framework of other multilateral institutions, but there were more than 30 such operational initiatives since the late 90s all the way till the mid 2010s. Now, when you think of technological collaboration, there are 4 stages. The very basic stage is knowledge sharing and coordination. So that basically is, if in physical settings, roundtables, conferences, etc., papers being presented, and so forth. And that's important. But the next stage becomes important where there is actual research, development, and demonstration that happens in a joint way. And then the third stage is that the technology then gets transferred. And the fourth stage is that the technology then gets deployed with very large deployment mandates, with regulatory standards and with financial incentives. That ultimately demonstrates that the original research and the time and the effort and the people that you put into an initiative actually yields an outcome that can be measured. Against that metric, most of these 30 plus initiatives that I investigated basically stopped at stage number 1, knowledge sharing. So we stopped at conferences, we stopped at workshops and talk shops. A few moved into research, development, and demonstration. Very few went into technology transfer, and almost none went to deployment mandate at scale. This is the challenge that we face. And to solve for that challenge, we have to ask, why is it that all these initiatives that get announced don't yield those final outcomes against the vision that we originally articulated? The challenges are very clear. Number 1, often there is absence of targeted research. There is no point doing general technological innovation where the problems that we're trying to solve for are much more here and now and urgent. Secondly, the technological collaborations often require technical and financial capacity on both sides. And this will be relevant for any kind of co-innovation that Japan engages in with other countries. Often the perception of the lack of financial capability or the lack of technical capability holds back from doing that co-innovation. The third related aspect is that intellectual property restrictions often impede deep collaboration. One approach, of course, is to design partnerships with participating institutions in both countries, but where the IP is jointly shared, or the IP is even in open source forms. And there are examples of how this has happened in international agricultural research, in the Human Genome Project, in nuclear physics in terms of the CERN particle accelerator, or even the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor. The IP conditions and the mandates there are very different than what has traditionally been used in terms of holding on to IP tightly and then transferring it bit by bit. And the fourth biggest challenge, perhaps, is that often there is the lack of an ecosystem to nurture innovation, an ecosystem that encourages venture and angel investment in the R&D side. The kind of R&D ecosystem that Japan has is not the same ecosystem of innovation that many other countries have. So now we know that we have a problem in terms of announcing a number of initiatives, dozens of initiatives that don't really yield the success, and we know why that actually happens. So what do? We have to then focus on what are some of the key principles that will guide better, more effective co-innovation initiatives going forward in response to those challenges. So let me outline for you what those principles would be. Number one, the objectives, the final objectives will matter. In the case of developing countries in Asia, you have to solve for twin problems. One, you have to solve for increasing access to energy because your economies are growing. And that energy has to come for your households, it has to come for your industry and everything in between. But two, you also have to solve for making sure that energy is cleaner because we don't have the luxury of the kind of developmental pathways advanced economies had been on. These two simultaneous energy transitions will require very clear target setting in terms of technical parameters, in terms of cost parameters. I think Michiko's presentation highlighted this as well, that unless we are cost sensitive, we will not be innovating to deploy at scale. Which brings me to the second principle of the prices mattering. And how do we make sure that the economy-wide costs are considered and not just the technological costs? Because once we factor in the externalities, the positive externalities, the co-benefits, suddenly the technology that seems very expensive begins to become a lot more viable. Third, in response to that perception of lack of financial or technical capacity, we have to pool resources, which means you pool resources, not just financial, but in kind, your laboratory facilities, your universities, your people. And that then can create the research consortia that make for effective co-innovative initiatives. And we will need innovative finance to de-risk the early stage of those investments. Those two valleys of death. There's a technical valley of death, and then there's a commercial valley of death. And only when you cross both valleys of death do you reach a sufficient scale that you're able to attract commercial capital. So let me then conclude with outlining for you some of the specific areas in which India and Japan could be doing some work together. And bear with me as I share that one slide. The major areas, I hope you can see my slide now. The major areas would center around infrastructure, energy, mobility, economy-wide broader decarbonization, critical natural resources, and tail-end risks. And let me just illustrate with a few examples here, right? Core infrastructure, public utilities, smart city systems. These are areas in which we could be doing it because the deployment in the Indian context will matter. In energy, especially with the massive rollout of renewables in India, the next frontier is foundational fuels like green hydrogen derived from renewables that then can be deployed in large industries that are heavy emitters. In mobility, given the history, the decades-long history of Indo-Japan collaboration on the automobile sector, it should be the forefront of collaboration in terms of electric and hybrid vehicles, as well as in terms of low carbon rail transport. On broader economy-wide decarbonization, sustainable cooling can become one very interesting area of collaboration. In critical minerals, the recycling and the circular economy of critical minerals will be critical for a low carbon transition for resource constrained economies like India. And finally, as the pandemic illustrates, we have to make our economies and our societies and our communities more resilient against climate risks. And Japan, again, has incredible experience of dealing with natural disasters and building in the resilient infrastructure to handle that. If we could do that, then we can create the modalities of pooled resources, IP sharing, etc., about which I'm happy to explain further in detail during the Q&A session. So thank you again for indulging me with your patience and giving me this opportunity. I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Ghosh, providing us kind of a critical review of 4 stages of technical collaboration and also identify 4 challenges. Then move on to your view on how to overcome such challenges. And then finally, you provide us some specific area for co-innovation between India and Japan. That's very helpful. Now, I'd like to move on to the next speaker, my long-term friend, Mr. Grish. You have the floor now.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Tamura-san. I hope I'm audible. Thanks for inviting me to this ICEP session on the subject of co-innovation. And let me say that it's always a privilege to work with IGES, with you and your team on various aspects which we have collaborated jointly with IGES over the years. I have been a regular to some of the past IGES ICEPs in Yokohama, but this time it's totally different and everybody is on a virtual mode. Now coming to this subject of this thematic session, can co-innovation accelerate Japanese technology transfer to Asia? I would just like to mention that to me, probably this is the only way forward. If one has to look at promoting the Japanese low carbon technologies in India and indeed in the other developing countries in the Asian region. Dr. Nandkumar in his background presentation and I think more clearly in the background working paper which was circulated earlier, he has mentioned that the initial costs and the high maintenance costs and the spares and these kind of issues of many of the low carbon technologies from Japan can be very high. And in many cases, let me use the word prohibitive. And hence they do act as a deterrent for the recipients to adopt these technologies. I've been working in the industry sector for many, many years now. And I can give a few cases where demonstration projects were set up or model projects were set up in India with partial financial support from the government of Japan. And the experience till date clearly shows that the scaling up actually has not happened in these cases. The demonstration projects happened, but the scaling up did not happen the way it was envisaged at the start of the project. Just to give 2 specific examples to drive home the point which I'm referring to, one from the large industries, and both these examples are of technology transfer attempts between Japan and India. One is from the large industries and the second is from the small and medium enterprise sector. If one looks at the Japanese large industries, we are all aware that the Japanese cement and steel industry is one of the most energy efficient in the world. There are many technology suppliers, innovators in Japan who have developed cleaner technologies, energy efficient technologies. And most of the Japanese cement and steel plants have adopted these plants. Steel plants in Japan and cement plants in Japan have adopted these technologies and as a result have benefited in terms of reduced energy consumption, reduced emissions. And one of those technologies is the waste heat recovery in the cement plants. Now this technology was again developed in Japan. It was transferred under a bilateral program to India and a project was set up in India, in South India, in one of the private cement sector factories in the year 2004. One of my colleagues visited this site just 2 or 3 years back. The plant is still operating more than 15 years back. It was set up absolute fantastic in terms of the overall efficiency levels. But what exactly happened was this demonstration plant actually helped in introducing this high-end technology to the Indian cement industry. They went ahead and started adopting the waste heat recovery options in the cement plants. Now we have close to, I think, 450 megawatt of equivalent of capacity operating in India. But what happened was that most of the cement plants in India actually went ahead and started procuring the technology from China. And majority of these suppliers in India today are Chinese suppliers. There are many such examples. I think Nandakumar in his paper also highlighted, mentioned briefly about the over-dependence of India on imports of the low-cost solar panels in its ever-growing renewable energy sector. Let me now turn to another example, which is actually more pertinent here. We at Terry and IGIS, we worked together for more than 10 years. This was another technology transfer project in which this was during the period 2010 to 2015, and it involved the technology transfer of low carbon technologies in the small and medium enterprise sector. This was through a grant from JICA initially to demonstrate. So two technologies were actually demonstrated in India, one in the dairy sector and one in the engineering sector in the small and medium enterprises in the state of Gujarat. In both these cases, the technology was demonstrated. It was well accepted by the Indian industry. Here again, the demonstration plants were set up. They are still operating and doing exceptionally well. The savings are of the order of 20 to 40% as compared to the conventional technologies. But again, the story is more or less the same. No further scaling up has happened. The initial costs are high, and there are challenges in terms of maintenance and spares in one or two cases. Now, what does these two examples clearly bring out? One thing which I can say is common in both these. That both were extremely good attempts at identifying the technologies, at promoting the low carbon technologies from Japan to India, but actually in the conventional model of technology transfer, which Dr. Nandakumar mentioned in his paper as sale of finished products from a developed country to a developing country. So in these cases, the equipments were imported from Japan, not manufactured here in India in most of the cases. And I would like to mention that I believe that in both these cases, if the co-innovation element, the way it has been envisaged in this paper, if that would have been built into the overall technology transfer process initially itself, it would have been totally different today. That these technology suppliers would have benefited and the Indian industry would have benefited by getting the best technology available. Now, let me, if I have a couple of minutes, 2 minutes, I'll try to contrast this whole thing with another example where Terry was actually very closely involved, almost for more than 10 to 12 years in another project, which was from the West. It was again with the European partners from Switzerland and UK. It was a technology transfer project where we worked with experts from Switzerland and UK to in an SME project. It was during the period 2000 and 2010. And here, what was different was that co-innovation was actually built into the technology transfer process right at the inception of the design stage of the project. So in this case, an energy efficient glass furnace was actually demonstrated. The knowledge was from the UK and Switzerland, and the technology was demonstrated. And ultimately now, once it was demonstrated in the year 2000, within a 10-year time span, more than 100 different furnaces came up in the cluster. So what was different was, and the reasons were that the costs were reasonable, there were no issues of maintenance and spares, local skill set got built, and most importantly, I would say that the local supply chain got built in this process. So it went through all the 4 or 5 stages which Dr. Arundhati Ghosh mentioned in terms of scaling up as well. So it was a typical process where you went up to the last stage and the saturation level was achieved within a span of close to around 10 years or so when the technology was initially introduced. It was a focused technology which was introduced. So I would like to give just 2 specific messages from my side that to be sustainable, technology transfer must take place as a part of the wider process of technological capacity building in the developing countries. So co-innovation, keeping the local context in mind, is the real long-term solution in this case. We need to have both the domestic and external partners working at all stages, starting from ideation, from feasibility studies, designing, demonstration, and also the dissemination stage. So entire RD, D&D. I think this is what we call it in the Swiss example. And second message, which I would just like to leave is that to me, technology transfer is not just the transfer of capital and goods, not even just services. It is also the know-how and the know-why of the technology. That is equally important. So both the hard and the soft parts of the technology are needed if we are to ensure that the technologies get assimilated and disseminated in the recipient countries. So these are the clear 2 messages which I would like to give. So ultimately, we need to get to the heart of the whole process in terms of the co-innovation and including both the hard and the soft part of the technology. So that's all at this stage. I'll be happy to answer any questions later. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Girish, for providing us some your observation on how difficult to move from the demonstration stage to scaling up stage. And also you could provide some good example actually how to overcome such challenges. Thank you very much. Then we'll move on to the next speakers. Mr. Dugal, now you have the floor.
Thank you very much, IJUS colleagues, for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. It's really a privilege to be among friends for a very intellectually stimulating conversation on the topic, which is very pertinent in today's context. I have put together a few slides, but the biggest dilemma or the difficulty of following such a galaxy of speakers is that there's very little left for you to speak. I'll still make an effort to share some information or my thoughts on this topic. On the first slide, what we have tried to put together is kind of a background information why this topic is very relevant. On the next slide, what we have tried to show here is the next one, please. That the Asia and the Pacific region, by virtue of the steep economic growth in the last decades, has become the center of GHG emissions also. So nearly 43% of the global GHG emissions come from the region. And if no some significant steps are taken in time, the region could very soon be emitting more than 50% of the global emissions. And on the next slide, if you have a quick look, it shows the kind of, the insufficiency of the NDCs. Countries have taken targets, ambitions under the Paris Agreement. But when we look at the targets versus the budget, we realize the ambitions need to be increased at least 3 times if you are looking at 2-degree targets and maybe 5 times if you're looking at 1.5 degrees. And mind you, these estimations are pre-pandemic level. Morrison very rightly drew our attention to the net zero targets, which is very important in today's context, because in the wake of pandemic, the economic slowdown has caused a reduction in the GHG emissions. But let's not forget that this reduction is only temporary, and the GHG emissions are likely to go up as soon as the economic activities scale back to pre-pandemic levels. And therefore, it is very important for countries to stay on course in achieving their NDCs. So, as I mentioned earlier, there's a strong need for countries to raise the ambition. The current level of ambition is not sufficient. So, in the context of countries raising their ambition, it is very important that we look at the technology, because we know that the green technologies hold the key. Technologies can make a significant contribution to countries' efforts to reduce GHG emission and charter on the low carbon development pathways. On the next slide, you would face the situation that most of you are already familiar in terms of the insufficiency of the NDC targets. And I would only labor the point that the current level of ambitions are not sufficient. Okay, so if countries have to stay on course in achieving their NDCs, they definitely need to adopt advanced low carbon technologies. So that is the kind of context that I see here. And my previous speakers have very rightly articulated the need for co-innovation, for the transfer of technologies, and also the benefit of technologies going to the demand centers. So my pick on the points, how can co-innovations help kind of countries in kind of accelerating their efforts on fight against climate change? Few things. From the theory, what we understand that any technology goes through three phases: the invention, the innovation, and then the diffusion. So what we are talking here is the next stage, the number 2 stage, which is the innovation. We have seen there are many technologies which have already been invented, but they are not properly diffused as yet. And there's a lot of scope for the countries to adopt those technologies. So what we are looking at the efforts to innovate in terms of bringing the technology for where those are going to be actually implemented. So to my mind, the co-innovation can contribute to the reduction of the lag. Usually there's a long lag, number of reasons. That could be procedural, that could be legal between the country. Dr. Ghosh mentioned about the intellectual property rights. There could be reasons for commercial reasons. There could be due diligence associated with it. Michiko-san very rightly mentioned about the valley of death. So there's a huge lag between when a technology is actually invented and whether the time technology is actually implemented at the point of consumption. So I think the co-innovation that we are talking today could actually kind of compact this time span between the two events to happen. The number 2 point that comes to my mind is it could reduce the cost of innovation, because then both sides, the country where the inventions have taken place and the way the innovation is happening, would be working on the competitive advantages, whether those come from the raw material, technology, or the equipments, human resources, or technical know-how. So I think this works for the technology on the both sides, the partners, to reduce the cost of innovation. And that brings me to the next point. When the cost of innovation is reduced, then it automatically brings the scale of its utilization. And once the scale of utilization is expanded, it draws on the economies of scale and opens up the new frontiers, which is, I think, what all are looking forward, including the ones, those who have invented the technologies, and the ones that are working together to co-innovate for its expansion onto the ground. One more point that comes to my mind before I move on to the final point, and that is reduce the risk of failure. We have seen a number of times many efforts to transfer the technology or even import technology which actually fails because the technology is not well suited to the country where it is getting imported. So in the concept of co-innovation, there is bound to be kind of a constant interaction among the various stakeholders. In that sense, the technology gets kind of developed in the backyard of the technology users, which actually enhances the chances of its success. And once that kind of risk is kind of mitigated, I think the partners that are involved into the transaction or kind of transfer of technology or its diffusion onto the ground are encouraged beyond the normal course of action to put more resources to a greater risk, bring it to the greater scale. And that brings me to the last point, that if the co-innovation can contribute to the reduction of the new and advanced low technologies, that can actually contribute to the not only to the economic activities in the country where it is brought up, but also can enhance the climate action. and that contributes to the point Dr. Ghosh was mentioning earlier, that it can bring about double dividends we are all looking forward to. So these are my two bits on the advantages of the co-innovation, and I'll very quickly bring you through the some of the efforts that ADB is doing, because one of the points that has been very clearly articulated is that the diffusion of advanced low carbon technologies oftentimes face various barriers. Among those barriers include the financing or the innovative financing instruments. And as a development finance institution, ADB tries its bit to support its developing member countries in Asia and the Pacific. Onto the slide number 8, what I have tried to portray is that ADB has very recently adopted its long-term strategy, what we call Strategy 2030, under which we have clearly articulated that 75% of our project portfolio by 2030 is going to be climate friendly, which again means the ones which are based on the advanced low carbon technologies. If I can bring to the slide number 9, yeah, the next one, please. The next one, please. Yeah. These are the 4 areas where we are working very keenly: clean energy, sustainable transport, sustainable urban development, and climate smart agriculture. I'm very happy these find resonance with what Dr. Ghosh was mentioning earlier. And onto the next slide, the taste of the pudding lies in eating. And this graph shows the kind of climate finance that ADB has been mobilizing in the past few years. This is one of the targets that we have set out under our long-term strategy. So as you can see that ADB's mobilization of climate finance to its developing member countries is on the constant rise. We back it up, 3 modalities onto the next slide, as you will very quickly see. We in addition to providing climate finance from our own resources, ADB also mobilizes concessional financing from additional resources and uses innovative finance like carbon market mechanism and catalyzes private capital. In the context of innovative finance that Dr. Nandakumar mentioned right at the beginning, we are using innovative method like the joint crediting mechanism, which has been propagated by the government of Japan. With this, I'll take a stop here and we'll be very happy to engage in any Q&A that may come up later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dugal, providing us some highlighting some potential role of the co-innovation, to fill in the gap between the innovation and implementation and the cost reduction, and also some scaling up. Okay, so next, last but not least, next speaker is Mr. Jaitri of TVL. You have the floor.
Thank you everyone for giving us this opportunity and bring a perspective from a Japanese company. I'm in a unique position because I'm working in India for Indian market, bringing Japanese technology in India. And having worked for 30 years in the industry, perhaps can bring the perspective from the customer and also from the supplier side. Before I go, I would just like quickly to talk about our company, what we do, and in what way we can, in fact, contribute to Indian industry. So TLV is a 70-year-old organization pioneering in steam engineering product. This is our factory in Kakogawa, Japan. Next slide, please. Next. So can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so it was funded in 1950 with the manufacturing. Can you go to the previous one, please? Looks like internet connection is not good here. The previous one. One more previous, please. Yes, yes, thank you very much. So it has its global presence. It is doing the business and steam engineering product, which are basically used in energy conservation, plant uptime, and process efficiencies, which are basically used in almost all type of industries which you can think of, process industries, whether it is food processing, steel manufacturing, power plant, hospital, hotel, almost everywhere we find application of these, and all of these energy consuming devices. That is where we bring in our expertise and knowledge for enhancing the efficiency and energy conservation. I think there is some problem in the slide. So can you please go to the fourth slide? I cannot see. We, yep. Yeah, yeah, that's fine. So with all these products which we manufacture and bring the technology in India, we have been associated with IGES, TT3 for quite some time and doing joint activities of providing our know-how, our process and systems to Indian customers by jointly visiting them and been little success in implementing those energy conservation systems. What we have learned in the past that as somebody mentioned, that prohibitive cost of technology, we need to bring in the concept of cost of buying and cost of owning. The cost of buying appears higher, but the cost of owning cheap technology is even higher, which we have realized, and we have made some inroad to make the customers and organizations realize that buying a cheap product in the beginning actually costs them more in the longer terms. And that is where one aspect which we have to somehow bring in the market. Next is that the innovation is not just industry driven. Innovation, as somebody highlighted, needs an ecosystem. An ecosystem is comprising of the regulatory framework, the institutions, which are educational, research institution, the input capacity from the industries to spend on R&D, the interest of the company to invest in new ideas, and also the market scenario. Most of the companies now moving on to higher value-added products have realized that unless otherwise they go into this direction, their returns and are not going to be so high. So the key is that we plan our things properly, we make investment in these institutions, and we also drive home point that if a supplier country or organization is supplying, what is it there for them also in the longer term? So I will wind up my discussion on this because most of the points have been covered by our previous speakers, and there is a limited time. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Jaitri,
That's all from my side.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Jaitri, providing us some insight from the private company point of view. So now I'd like to move on to the panel, some Q&A session. Yes. So first question to Ms. Enomoto. Yeah, we have a specific question to you. So how does your center, APCTT, see co-innovation and its potential role in technology collaboration between developed and developing countries in Asia?
Thank you very much for this very valid question. So I think the co-innovation is a really high stage of technology collaboration, and it should be encouraged. But when we discuss co-innovation, we have to be careful about the difference between invention as a result of research and development and innovation process. Because many people talk about joint research and development, which is happening, but innovation is a stage of the developed technologies into commercialization. This is a totally different process, which is done by mainly by the private enterprises. So we really have to be clear about this point. So we also have to see the reality check whether co-innovation is happening in which domain. And I think government-led initiative is good, but the government should not dictate which type of technology, which particular technology to be transferred, because government and even international organization, we are not the expert on the market situation, etc. So we have to see the role of the government is providing general directions of toward low carbon technology promotions and providing enabling policy. With reference to the specific role of APCTT, contrary to the name of Asian Pacific Center for Transfer of Technologies, we are not transferring technologies. We are United Nations Organization Regional Institute in India. From India, we are serving 43 countries in Asia Pacific in past 43 years. We have a unique role to educate and to provide a capacity building of the developing countries' policymakers to improve national innovation system, environment for the receiving technologies, and to facilitate co-innovation, let's say. So we organize a capacity building mainly targeted to the member states, policymakers, help them to network and cooperate together. Another important aspect of the APCTT's contribution in these areas, we are also facilitating a creation of a tech specialist network. Like after organizing our events, spontaneously the experts in the world in the Asia Pacific region create, like for example, Asia Pacific Nanotechnology Research and Development Management Network, renewable energy network for the Asia Pacific. So we promote the creation of the network of the experts, which indeed will facilitate co-innovation, co-research and development in the future. And also APCTT provides online platforms for the technology owners and also technology seekers to check the available technologies, not only from the developed countries, but only many are coming from the developing countries like India and China and different parts of the world. We have a technology database, technology for SMEs, renewable technology bank, and also provide publications through facilitating the role of the private sector. And we are providing online platforms to facilitate the efforts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we have a much clear idea of the role of your institute. Okay, so next question is pointed to the Mr. Ghosh, Dr. Ghosh. In the view of Indian government initiative toward self-reliant India, to what extent do you consider technology collaboration with Japan will be important for India?
Thank you for that question. I'm going to answer that question in two parts. One is in terms of how we have established collaborations in the past and how we could build on that. And second is what is India itself looking to do in terms of technological innovation in the coming years. Now, as many of the speakers had highlighted, we've had a very, very rich engagement with Japan on a range of different issues in terms of technological collaboration. It has come in the form of direct technology transfer. It has come in the form of co-developing technologies. It has come in the form of adapting technologies to deploy in the Indian context. So there is a long, rich history of technology-driven foreign direct investment coming into India. And we should build on it. Now, going forward, what do we need to do? First, we have to recognize where is the Indian broader ecosystem for innovation, how it is developing. This year, the government of India has of the energy and hello, can you see me? I seem to have lost connection. You can still hear me? Great. Let me continue.
Yeah, please continue.
Thank you. So earlier this year, Government of India appointed me as co-chair of the Energy, Climate Change and Environment track of its new science, technology and innovation policy. Now we must recognize this is only the 5th time since independence that India has produced such a policy. The first one was actually written personally by the first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, way back in 1958. And then we had one in 1983, one in 1998, and then one in 2013. One in 2003, then 2013, and now. So this is a very important moment because these moments don't arise often in a 70 years, more than 70 years of India's independent history, only 5 such moments. In that moment, giving very specific direct focus on low carbon technology development, which had not been so explicitly articulated in the past, is another moment. Within that, many of the issues that Mr. Duggal mentioned in terms of the kind of emissions trajectories we need to follow, the points that Nand Kumar mentioned and Mr. Sethi mentioned, these are all absolutely going to be informing the way that policy will get implemented. And therefore, my final submission with regards to your question, how can we take the strong history of collaboration with Japan in the past and the current moment that India is shaping its new innovation ecosystem to build on something better? I would strongly push for a few key targeted challenges that India and Japan can solve for. And one of those should be, I believe, in industrial energy. Because as I mentioned earlier, there is this big shift in renewables that India is already undertaking. It will be the largest renewable energy market in the world after China. Massive targets. But how do we deploy that renewables towards something beyond electricity? And can we look at foundational fuels like green hydrogen? Japan has a long history of working on hydrogen per day. Now, can India's renewable story and Japan's hydrogen story come together to look at green hydrogen as a major challenge that it solves for the world? Fukushima already has a 10 megawatt plant generating green hydrogen. Where it will get deployed? It will get deployed in heavy industry like steel, like cement, like fertilizer. So that's one big challenge that we can be looking at. Second, as I mentioned, is on sustainable mobility and electric and hybrid vehicles, where again, the larger ecosystem of battery manufacturing and recycling of battery minerals will create new jobs and new enterprises in that broader value chain. Third, given how Japan became significantly energy efficient after the Fukushima nuclear accident, the Cool Biz initiative, etc., India has to cool itself without greater global warming. So collaboration on building energy efficiency, particularly with focus on sustainable cooling, which then goes beyond buildings and looks at the broader supply chain, the cold chain in agriculture, the cooling systems needed for vaccine storage in our health facilities, all of that becomes another area of collaboration. We can list more sectors. But I think if there are 2 or 3 such big ideas that we say, here is how we are pooling resources, here we are bringing in private and public entities together, we're forming consortia to jointly own R&D, as India and US did in 2010, 11, 12 through the joint clean energy R&D centers. We need to have such big ideas and big announcements that follow.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ghosh. Yeah, it's really exciting to know that the new Indian government initiative on technology innovation, and also thank you very much for providing us some big picture of a future collaboration, such as using renewable energy for hydrogen and sustainable mobility as well. Thank you very much. And then I would like to move on to the next question to Girish. So, how to overcome challenges to technology collaboration, and how far can innovation help in this regard? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Tamura-san, I think, for this question. I've touched upon some of these points in my earlier intervention, but I would just like to mention that as far as I think the most important point in the when we're talking about co-innovation, the first thing would be to actually have the right technology choices right from the inception stage. Dr. Ghosh just mentioned about hydrogen. It could be anything. I think the point what I wanted to make here is that the main point will be to have the right technology choices right from the inception stage or the ideation stage, and then involve all the actors during the entire process. One has to be really focused. It can't be generic technologies. It has to be very specific what exactly we are talking about. And if one is, say, talking about something like a technology which is already commercial. Hydrogen is not something which is already commercial. Maybe in Japan it's commercial to a certain extent. But I think it could be anything. We worked with TLV as a part of this project. Some of the technologies which they are trying to promote in the same systems are already commercial in Japan. But I think the point what I wanted to drive here is that it will be important to look at the stage of the technology itself. If it is already a commercial technology in Japan or elsewhere, the customization of the technology to suit the local needs so that you're able to use the local materials, the local skills, and that is actually, and develop the, I would say, the local supply chains. And if that is able to happen in this whole process of co-innovation, then obviously the biggest barrier which one talks about, the upfront costs, that gets taken care of. So to me, that's an extremely important point. And the second point which I just wanted to mention, I think in this regard, I think is also the issue of timelines. We have been talking about in the past, from my experience of working, we always talk about 1 year, 2 year kind of thing in these projects. If the governments have to come into the picture in terms of supporting this co-innovation, to me, the projects must be, at least in the, when you call it as a project, they must be for long duration, minimum 4 year, 5 year, because this is not going to happen in 1 year or 2 year kind of a thing. So to me, I think it's important to really look at the technology choices, customization, and then the time frame in which one really wants to work before it actually becomes a technology which can actually move on its own on a commercial way. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so pointed out importance of engaging the local. Sorry, thank you very much, Grish, providing some your view. So importance of engagement of local supply chain, and also we need to be patient to get good result. And finally, I'd like to move on to next final question. So it is Edgar, yeah. Advanced technology is critical in achieving emission reduction goal. So what additional role do you expect technology collaboration to play in the climate mitigation target in COVID and post-COVID period?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for posing this very interesting question to me. In my previous intervention, I highlighted the fact that the co-innovation of advanced low carbon technologies would not only reduce GHG emission, but they would also tend to reduce the cost of climate actions. If that holds true, then I would say that these interventions would actually help countries to enhance their climate ambition over a period of time. So that being said, that's one good area that I identify going beyond just reduction of GHG emissions. But in terms of looking at the other co-benefits, I would like to draw upon a study the ADB conducted for one of its carbon fund, the Future Carbon Fund, which is supporting more than 30 mitigation projects. Sorry. A couple of years back, we sent out teams to the ground to talk to the local communities to figure out what kind of co-benefits are those projects delivering to those local communities beyond just reducing tons of CO2, which is very important, which is why those projects were actually conceived to start with. And then we realized that those projects were actually not only reducing tons of CO2, but they were also contributing to a number of co-benefits for the local communities and beyond. So then we tried to kind of map those co-benefits to different SDGs. And then we realized that the mitigation actions, that if they are designed very well, if they are implemented very well, if they are monitored properly, they can not only reduce GHG emissions, but also bring about a host of co-benefits and contribute to a number of SDGs. Very briefly, I know I have a run against the clock. The study that we conducted told us that in addition to SDG number 13, which is on climate change, those projects contributed to SDG number 7 on affordable clean energy, SDG number 8 on the economic growth, and SDG number 9 on the innovation. So this was a good lesson for us to draw out of that study. But of course, these types of co-benefits do not occur automatically, do not occur in isolation, and we need to provide them a multidimensional support, and they required a host of kind of incentives to overcome various barriers. I would like to once again go back to Nandakumar's point at the beginning about the additional co-financing support these mitigation actions may require, and one such opportunity is to support those projects through carbon markets. So these projects did receive carbon market support, but I'm quite sure if coordinated very well, the other carbon market mechanisms like the joint crediting mechanism or the new market mechanisms under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement could be very important conduits of mobilizing additional climate finance that these projects require, that can eventually kind of roll back, not only contribute to the tons of CO2 reductions that we are all looking for, but also contribute a host of co-benefits and contribute to SDGs. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for pointing out some importance of co-benefit and also interlinkage between climate mitigation and other SDGs. And final question to Mr. Jetri.
Yes, please.
So, what are the critical challenges you see for Japanese technology and equipment in adapting to Indian market? And also, if you wish to share your view, the view from your colleague, Mr. Nakajima.
Well, as far as a Japanese company is concerned, I think being in India, first I will look at as an Indian and think that why would a Japanese company invest, transfer technology if it doesn't have any benefit in return? So from that point of view, we need to provide a conducive environment, a competitive market, and protect the intellectual property rights of the company. First of all, that. Can it be done? Yes, very much possible. What opportunity exists for the Japanese companies here? Huge, huge. Are Indian companies ready to invest? Yes, there are many cases. And we have seen ourselves with a small beginning. Now, from the company point of view, from a Japanese company point of view, what can be done? And as Mr. Sethi very rightly pointed out, to some extent, local adaptation and localization, which can offer huge competitiveness without sacrificing the uniqueness and the quality. If we can focus in a short term this, there is huge opportunity from the Japanese companies, and also Indian organization will benefit tremendously, because we have seen ourselves that what we have achieved in a Japanese market compared to what is possible in Indian market in terms of reduction of carbon footprints, in terms of energy saving, in terms of improving profitability, and which in turns give benefit down the line to the society also. So there are tremendous opportunities and potential. We need to think out of box and perhaps come out of some mentality from both sides, that from the Indian organization point of view, respecting the cost of the ownership, looking at the overall value proposition a technology offers, rather than a cheap buying one-time cost and then crying forever. From the Japanese company point of view, looking at the Indian perspective and how we can create a competitive pricing structure, competitive products which suits to Indian market, however, offers you huge opportunities. So that's all I can say from my side. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Jairiti, for providing your view. And also, thank you very much for all the speakers providing us very rich discussion and your views on this co-innovation. Yeah, we got a variety of views, so it is difficult to summarize. But for that role, I'd like to ask my colleague, Eric, please.
Sorry, can I come in on one point? If you don't mind, can I come in for 30 seconds?
Yes, or 30 seconds. Yes, please.
Yes. I just wanted to reiterate something that Mr. Jaitley mentioned very clearly, that it has to make sense on both sides. But one thing we have not discussed on this panel is how can it make sense on both sides by looking beyond the Indian and the Japanese markets. So how can Indo-Japanese co-innovation on low carbon technologies then serve other markets? Because sometimes it might not meet the cost parameters for India, but the technical capability here can join with the technical capability in Japan to develop something elsewhere that still gives the scale economies that can then eventually bring down costs for here as well. So we should not limit the co-innovation just to a bilateral exchange.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's very interesting and important point of view. Yeah, really, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, colleagues, for extremely useful discussion and dialogue. We're a little bit beyond time, so I'm going to keep my summary quite short. I'd just like to highlight a few key points that came up recurrently throughout the discussion. First and foremost, I think we heard quite a bit about the need for mapping the technology ecosystems in different countries. I think this idea of ecosystem is a nice way of framing the different laboratories, the researchers, as well as the companies and government actors that will work on this co-innovation process. So I'd like to encourage us to think a little bit more concretely about what this ecosystem looks like in Japan and India, as well as other countries, and where there's overlaps and where there are potential gaps between those ecosystems. The second point I'd like to highlight are some areas for concrete collaboration. Was mentioned the green hydrogen is one opportunity. Mobility solutions, especially electric vehicles, is another opportunity. And also buildings, especially sustainable cooling. I think these are very concrete areas. I think there are potentially a few more, but I think that this gives us somewhere to look forward to. The third point I would like to highlight is I think as we try to move this discussion forward, I know that Japan next year hopes to have some conference on the linkages between climate change and SDGs, between UNFCCC and the SDG processes. And in this context, I think there's an opportunity to continue this dialogue. And in particular, I think we want to focus on two issues. One is, Nandu has begun to really put some detail into what this co-innovation process looks like. And I think we've also, from today's discussion, can discern what might be some of the critical principles to make co-innovation move forward. So I'd like to try to underline what one of those principles might look like in a future workshop. The second point, and this is an area of personal interest for me, is looking more concretely at these co-benefits. I think from a developing country perspective, the air pollution, the gender equity issues, the social empowerment issues are critical if technology transfer is going to work. And I think there's a lot of opportunities, especially in a climate finance setting, but also even in a domestic policy making setting, to more systematically analyze these co-benefits and then build them into decision-making processes. So I'd like to encourage us to think about how we can more systematically assess the co-benefits and develop a standardized set of principles for co-innovation. Thank you very much, and I appreciate everybody's participation.